Critical race theory, a movement started in colleges, is now infecting our public schools, businesses, and even some of our churches, indoctrinating people to believe that America was founded on racism, prospered on racism, and is inherently saturated with racism. So, what is the solution to all this racism? Apparently, more racism. Rosie the Riveter here, dropping more truth bombs to blow your mind. Let me ask you, if you were a white supremacist, what policies would you enact? Would you want to separate dormitories for white and non white students? Would you want separate graduations for white and non white students? How about other events in general? Would you keep the white population separate from others? Would you find any event in life that you would keep the whites and the non whites apart and force that separation? You would, wouldn't you? Because that's exactly what happened in the post Civil War era until the 1960s civil rights movement. Newsflash, it's back! However, the difference between now and then is that many in the African American community are not only accepting it, they are pushing it, promoting it, and calling people racist for not participating in the segregation. So, we went from realizing that segregating schools, restaurants, church, water fountains was racist and must be overcome to forcing minorities to interact with white people is racist. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you a white supremacist utopian dream. And spoiler alert, it's not the idea of Trump and his supporters. But how does this happen, you ask? Because it's the same progressive party, the Confederate South, that is pushing it, all the while claiming to be the party of diversity, equality, and inclusion. The reality is, the party that wanted segregation 50 to 200 years ago is still insisting on keeping the non-whites away from the whites. They've had just enough time to actually get the segregated to agree to it and even organize it. Slave owners in the 1800s told their slaves that the Union Northerners were actually devils, complete with horns and tails. They scared slaves into thinking that their enslavement was better for them, more beneficial, convincing them life would be horrible for them if they escaped to freedom. Slave owners convinced slaves that they had a home, they had food, sort of, and they were taken care of in the plantation. Today, that same party is scaring their current slaves, otherwise known as voters, that the Republicans will take their Social Security and Medicare benefits. That's been the Democrat mantra since the New Deal bought off the African American population in the 1960s, and the program has been a complete disaster for Black Americans, and things aren't getting any better. Buy them off because they can't find out freedom, though tougher, is better. To run from their racist past and disastrous policies, the Democrats cooked up the idea of the Great Switch, a fairy tale story of how the parties magically changed their platforms in the 1960s and 70s. Sounds more like a pretty bad LSD trip, don't you think? Here's the idea. A faction of the Democratic Party, known as Dixiecrats, vehemently opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Out of anger, they supposedly switched to the Republican Party. You know, the party that literally started with the purpose of ending slavery. But that's not all. Republicans, who have always supported civil rights legislation, supposedly then switched to the Democratic Party, all because of this act that only passed because of overwhelming Republican support. So, we are expected to believe that these Dixiecrats hated the black civil rights so much that they ran to the party that gave black Americans the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and multiple other civil rights legislation, while freedom-loving Republicans jumped to the party that did everything they could to stop civil rights legislation until known racist Lyndon B. Johnson finally allowed it in efforts to gain black votes. It's a good thing I have on strong, sturdy work boots because that story is so full of horse manure that I can't see the floor. Carol Swain, a professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, explains it perfectly in a video she did for Prager University.
In the 1960s and 70s, everything supposedly flipped. Suddenly, the Republicans became the racists, and the Democrats became the champions of civil rights. Fabricated by left-leaning academic elites and journalists, the story went like this. Republicans couldn't win a national election by appealing to the better nature of the country. They could only win by appealing to the worst. Attributed to Richard Nixon, the media's all-purpose bad guy, this came to be known as the Southern Strategy. It was very simple. Win elections by winning the South. And to win the South, appeal to racists. So the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, were to now be labeled the party of rednecks. But this story of the two parties switching identities is a myth. In fact, it's three myths wrapped into one false narrative. Let's take a brief look at each myth in turn. Myth number one, in order to be competitive in the South, Republicans started to pander to white racists in the 1960s. Fact, Republicans actually became competitive in the South as early as 1928 when Republican Herbert Hoover won over 47% of the South's popular vote against Democrat Al Smith. In 1952, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower won the southern states of Tennessee, Florida, and Virginia. And in 1956, he picked up Louisiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia too. And that was after he supported the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated public schools, and after he sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock Central High School to enforce integration. Myth number two, Southern Democrats, angry with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, switched parties. Fact, of the 21 Democratic senators who opposed the Civil Rights Act, just one became a Republican. The other 20 continued to be elected as Democrats or were replaced by other Democrats. On average, those 20 seats didn't go Republican for another 2.5 decades. Myth number three, since the implementation of the Southern Strategy, the Republicans have dominated the South. Fact, Richard Nixon, the man who is often credited with creating the Southern Strategy, lost the Deep South in 1968. In contrast, Democrat Jimmy Carter nearly swept the region in 1976, 12 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in 1992, over 28 years later, Democrat Bill Clinton won Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The truth is, Republicans didn't hold a majority of Southern congressional seats until 1994, 30 years after the Civil Rights Act. As Kevin Williamson of National Review writes, if Southern rednecks ditched the Democrats because of a civil rights law passed in 1964, it is strange that they waited until the late 1980s and early 1990s to do so. They say things move slower in the South, but not that slow.
Carol Swain concludes by explaining how the South itself has changed. They are not the racist and bigots the left wants you to think they are. They are pro-life, pro-gun and pro-small government. The dynamics of the South didn't change because they grew more racist. They changed because the South became less racist, eventually migrating to the party that truly fights for equality and freedom for all. Today's Democratic Party cannot compete with that, so they fall back to their worn-out old playbook. Call them racist, call them Nazis, call them white nationalists. The look at a few prominent Democrats proves that the whole great switch mantra is nothing more than gaslighting. In 1999, Al Gore claimed that his father, Al Gore Sr., was a civil rights activist, when the truth is far from it. Curious, Dennis Speed researched Sr.'s congressional history to find the truth. He discovered Senator Albert Gore Sr. opposed the measures to end segregation. In 1964, Senator Gore first tried to render the Civil Rights Act impotent. When that effort failed, he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In truth, the record of the Gore clan on civil rights issues reads more like a criminal's rap sheet. If the Great Switch is true, why did Al Gore Sr., who opposed the civil rights legislation in 64, die a lifelong proud Democrat in 1998 instead of following the Dixiecrats over to the Republican Party? If the Great Switch is true, why did Joe Biden, who has always been a diehard Democrat, oppose busing desegregation in 1977? Likewise, if the Great Switch is true, why did Biden praise such Democrat segregationalists as Senator James Eastland, Senator Herman Talmadge, and Governor George Wallace? Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, a former KKK recruiter, coincidentally leaving the organization when he started his political career, filibustered the 1964 Civil Rights Act. If the Great Switch is true, why did he die a lifelong Democrat in 2010 instead of switching to the Republicans when the act still went through? Following his death, he was showered with the praise and admiration of the Democratic Party and honorably eulogized by Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Nancy Pelosi. The man who casually used the N-word was called a friend by Joe Biden. He was a friend and mentor to Hillary Clinton, and Nancy Pelosi called him a great American patriot. So people like Al Gore Sr., Lyndon B. Johnson, and Biden all have histories of opposing civil rights and desegregation. But the Great Switch tells us that all those racists went to the Republican Party, while all those supporting civil rights and desegregation became Democrats. Really? Do you know how we know this is all bunk? Ask yourself, which party is supporting today's segregation movement while suppressing the religious, medical, and parental civil rights of their opponents? And you'll have your answer. Come on, America, we're better than this. The Great Switch is 100% grade A cow patties. And it's time we stand up, say so, and refuse to let those pushing this obvious propaganda get away with it. I'm Rosie the Riveter, and that's my 2 cents. But what do you think? Leave your comments down below, hit the like and subscribe, and don't forget to punch the notification bell so you can get new videos when they are uploaded. You can find all my videos and liberating letters, along with links to hundreds of articles fighting fake news and propaganda, including the ones I referenced in this video on thefaxpaper.com. Don't lose heart. We are winning. We will be great again. We can do it.